Okay, thank you very much. That's a paper with Mayra Colace, who's at the Econ in Montevideo. And it's about gender-targeted transfers. So it's not about an unconditional cash transfer. As you're going to see, we look at a conditional cash transfer for Uruguay. But the conditionality is never binding. So at the end of the day, that's very similar to an unconditional cash transfer. And we try to bring some methodological contribution by putting together a structural model of a household resource distribution to measure individual poverty and a regression discontinuity design. So the motivation is relatively clear because there's a huge literature and policy literature saying that cash transfer targeted to women, as it's the case in many CCT and UCT, are good for women, but are also good for children. There's, in fact, little evidence of that. I'm going to come back to this. There's all this CCT in Latin America, well documented, and many arguments around that. But the literature was, in fact, in the beginning, more a correlation between individual expenditure for women or children and the money controlled by women, so not really something causal. Then came the papers around Progresa in Mexico, where you had randomized cash transfer. But on top of the randomization, there are also the income effects and the conditionalities that may affect the result or the interpretation of the results. And more recently, you have several RCTs where the conditional cash transfer has a randomized element, which is the identity of the recipient, whether it's given to men or women for the exact same amount of money. So that's the cleanest, in a way, the cleanest experiment to see if it matters to give money to women rather than to men. And the result of these few papers is that it has improved, it tends to improve women's decision power and expenditure, but not systematically, and usually the results are not really in favor of an improvement of child conditions from this. So there are many different types of interpretation, but I mean the idea is that these are a few RCTs, and to replicate this at a large scale for realistic policy settings, it's difficult to systematically randomize, so we need to also rely on natural experiments. So that's what we are doing here, and we're looking at individual poverty, which is not observed. So we're using a structural model, so-called collective model, to recover individual resource shares in families. So we look at a CCT, a conditional cash transfer for Uruguay, called AFAM, so large scale, and we use a natural experiment. It's going to be a regression discontinuity design where you're not going to see the usual graph around the discontinuity because the outcome is not observed. The outcome is the resource share of women and the resource share of children, and eventually the poverty of women and the poverty of children based on their own resources. That's something we recover, we estimate in the model, but that is obviously not in any kind of data set. So the principle of the RDD is the same around the threshold of the proxy means test for the cash transfer. And we address with the structure of the model both income effect and the conditionality. As I mentioned, this transfer as a conditionality on sending children to school, but for the children we look at, they are already all at school basically, so there's really no additional effect of this condition in here. So the originality is again to embed the regression discontinuity within the structural model and to recover individual poverty based on recent method that me and others have suggested here. So the AFAM is again targeted to poor households with children, usually assigned to the mother. There's again a proxy means test with a threshold. The score is not manipulatable, and again the conditionality is not effective. All the children under 13 are basically at school already. Okay, we use a survey, a household budget survey. So we're going to use expenditure to estimate a demand system. And if you look at the bottom part of that slide, so we have household expenditure, and in particular, we're going to use one good, which is very useful, which is clothing, because clothing is assignable to men, women, and children. So we're not using it as a welfare index, but based on this emerged part of the iceberg, which is household distribution of resources, we are going to infer the whole process of distribution for all the other goods in the household. So again, using this assignable good. And I'm not going to, I don't have time to go in the technicities here. You have to believe me that this method is meaningful, and I directly show you the results. So here what we're having is the effect on, the marginal effect on resource shares for, so the resource share of children, women, and men for different functional form of the regression discontinuity design around the threshold, as usually done. And you see there's an effect for women, a significant effect for rural women, not for urban women. It's not significant for men and children, but if you add up the two, you have, of course, the opposite of the positive effect for women. It's around 6-7 points of percentage, which is, and women have around 30% of the resource share, so that's an improvement if they are eligible for the cash transfer. That's an improvement in their consumption share by around 20-24%. We do a lot of robustness checks. We do the usual RDD manipulation tests. We do the alternative specification using additional controls that could be important, because several papers show that there might be an effect also on employment within the household. So we control for that. We also change the bandwidth around the threshold. And an important check is, I show here, is rather than having a modeling of the household that's based on possibly a household where you have many women and many men in the household, you can have a couple, men couple, but also the brother of him, the mother of her, etc., etc. We also zoom on nuclear household. You just have one woman, one man, and the children. So where the interpretation is cleaner and clearer. And in this nuclear household, you see that the gain for women is actually coming essentially from a loss for men. So you see the opposite coefficient in this case. And we have an alternative model where children are not receiving a share by themselves. They are a public good in the household. And in this case, we have, again, a very, of course, by structure here, you have exactly the opposite coefficient for men compared to the coefficient for women. And it's cross-validated by a past paper using final say variable exactly on the same type of RDD, but this time with the final say which is observable in the data. And the last point I'll make is once you have the impact on women's resource share, and we see there's no impact for children, you can calculate the impact for poverty based on individual consumption. So without this cash transfer, the poverty of women is 21.4%. That's the middle number at the top. With the income effect of a farm, the money that the household receives, which is shared by everyone, but at different proportions, then the poverty of women fall down to 15.8%. If there was no income effect, but only the bargaining effect, only this negotiation effect due to the fact that the money is going to them, to women, then just the bargaining effect would make that their poverty goes down to 16.7%. And when you combine the income effect and the bargaining effect, then the poverty of women fall down to 14%. Okay, so that's the cumulative effect, and we can decompose these two elements here. So as a conclusion, we find, as in many RCTs, but here in a natural experiment setting, we find a redistributive effect for women, but mainly for rural women, who are the one with the largest margin of improvement compared to the initial situation, in line with some of the literature, but it does not trickle down to children. There's no, and it's, we have additional check looking at some specific goods like education and so on. And that's consistent with the bulk of the recent literature I just mentioned on RCT, where you randomize the beneficiary And the potential interpretation is that children are not poor in the first place, especially in Uruguay, but that could be true in other settings and poorer settings where I would call that sacrificial women, where women would give a lot of their own resources to children even before they get any form of transfer. And so where there's new money, new cash coming in, then they would spend it on themselves rather than on children to catch up. Okay, that's something that is seen, or it's a possible interpretation, not only here, but in other settings. And it means that the arguments that we find that there are different arguments to give money to women, the argument that it would trickle down to children is not the one to retain, but really the one in terms of empowerment and gender consumption gap is more the argument that we would push forward given this result. Thank you very much.